Now I have observed many species throughout my tenure as a diplomatic liaison, but none quite as, shall we say, entertaining as Commander Zek'tal of the Kethmoran Empire. Standing 7 feet tall with 4 arms and an ego roughly the size of a gas giant, Zek'tal possessed that special combination of stupidity and authority that makes for truly spectacular disasters. Haven's rest station hummed with its usual afternoon traffic. Traders, diplomats, and various spacers moved through the docking bays like clockwork. Everything was perfectly routine until Captain Sarah Blake's cargo hauler, the Lucky Strike, requested docking clearance at Bay 17. Zek'tal's antennae twitched with what he believed was professional intuition, but what I recognized as barely contained paranoia. "Another human vessel," he announced to his subordinates, all 4 hands gesturing dramatically. "Mark my words, Officer Nimco. These primitives are up to something." Officer Nimco, a sensible Kethmoran who clearly questioned his career choices daily, simply nodded. "Sir, her manifest shows standard agricultural cargo, coffee beans from Earth's colonies." "Coffee beans." Zek'tal's voice cracked with indignation. "Do you take me for a fool, Nimco? Coffee beans, indeed, obviously a code word for some primitive human weaponry." I should mention here that Zek'tal had never actually encountered coffee beans. His species sustained themselves on a nutrient paste that tasted, according to reliable sources, like disappointment mixed with regret. The concept that any species would willingly consume bitter plant matter for pleasure was beyond his comprehension. Captain Sarah Blake emerged from her ship wearing standard hauler coveralls and the patient expression of someone who dealt with bureaucrats for a living. She was average height for a human, with short brown hair and the kind of practical demeanor that suggested she had little time for nonsense. Which, as we shall see, was about to become problematic. "Welcome to Haven's Rest," Zek'tal announced, puffing out his chest in what he imagined was an intimidating manner. "I am Commander Zek'tal of the Galactic Patrol. Your vessel requires thorough inspection." Sarah handed over her data pad without complaint. "Standard agricultural shipment, Commander. Manifests all there. Coffee beans from the Kepler colonies bound for the Centauri trade routes." Zek'tal examined the manifest with the intensity of someone trying to crack an ancient code. His 4 eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the cargo details. 600 tons of coffee beans. How convenient. And what, pray tell, makes these beans so valuable that humans would transport them across half the galaxy? "People like to drink coffee," Sarah replied with the tone of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. "It's a stimulant, helps you stay awake." "Stay awake for what? Planning attacks? Coordinating invasions?" Zek'tal's paranoia was now in full bloom. "I think not, human. This requires a full security inspection." Namco glanced at me with the expression universal among intelligent beings forced to work for incompetent superiors. I merely shrugged. After 3 years of observing Zek'tal's career, I had learned that attempting to inject logic into his thought processes was like trying to teach quantum physics to a houseplant. "Commander," Sarah said, her patience already wearing thin, "you're welcome to inspect the cargo, but I'm on a tight schedule. The beans need to reach Centauri Prime before they lose their freshness rating." "Freshness rating," Zek'tal repeated slowly, as if the words were somehow suspicious. "Yes, I'm sure your weapons need to remain fresh." And there it was, the moment when a routine cargo inspection transformed into what would become known throughout the galaxy as the Table Incident. All because one overconfident Kethmoran officer couldn't accept that sometimes coffee beans are just coffee beans. Zek'tal strutted aboard the Lucky Strike with all the grace of a drunken diplomat at a peace treaty signing. His 3 subordinates followed behind, clearly wishing they had chosen different career paths, perhaps professional asteroid mining or dangerous wildlife photography. "Impressive vessel," Zek'tal announced, though he pronounced it like someone commenting on a particularly offensive odor. Primitive, of course, but impressively primitive. Sarah Blake led them through her ship with the weary professionalism of someone who had endured countless inspections. The Lucky Strike was a working vessel, clean but lived in, with the practical design humans favored when they actually needed things to function properly. "Cargo bays through here," Sarah said, palming the access panel. 600 tons of premium coffee beans from Kepler 442b. Each container's labeled and sealed according to Galactic Trade Commission standards. The cargo bay opened to reveal neat rows of sealed containers, each marked with shipping codes and destination information. To any rational being it looked exactly like what it was, agricultural cargo being transported for commerce. Zek'tal, however, possessed a talent for seeing conspiracies where none existed. Very convenient, he muttered, all four hands now active as he gestured at the containers. Sealed containers, hidden contents. Tell me, human, what do your so-called coffee beans really contain? Explosive compounds? Chemical weapons? Miniaturized invasion craft? Sarah's eye actually twitched, just slightly, but I noticed it, and so did Nimco, who was developing that look of someone slowly backing away from a ticking bomb. They contain coffee beans, Commander. Would you like me to open a container for inspection? Of course you would offer that, Zek'tal declared triumphantly. The obvious containers are decoys, the real weapons are hidden elsewhere. He began rummaging through Sarah's carefully organized cargo bay like a child having a tantrum in a toy store. Now, I should explain something about human psychology here. Humans possess this fascinating trait called patience, which allows them to endure significant irritation without immediate violence. However, this patience has limits, and Zek'tal was approaching those limits with the determination of a heat-seeking missile. Sir, Sarah said, her voice still controlled, you're damaging my securing equipment. That's expensive to replace. Zek'tal had somehow managed to tangle himself in the cargo netting while attempting to peer behind the containers. Security concerns override your... He freed himself with a dignity that would have impressed no one, then proceeded to the crew quarters. Sarah's personal cabin was small but tidy, containing the usual collection of items that make a ship feel like home, rather than just a workplace. This is where Zek'tal's limited understanding of other species truly shined. He picked up a framed photograph showing Sarah with what were obviously her family members, 2 adult humans and 3 smaller ones that even a moron could identify as human offspring. Ah, Zek'tal announced with the satisfaction of someone who believed they had made a breakthrough. Evidence of your breeding program. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop several degrees. That's my family, Sarah said quietly. Yes, your breeding stock. Typical human practice, I'm told. Mass reproduction to support your expansionist agenda. Zek'tal waved the photograph carelessly. How many offspring does one human typically produce for military purposes? Nimco actually stepped backwards. I do not exaggerate when I say the officer looked ready to request an immediate transfer to somewhere safer, like a war zone. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. Those are my children, Commander, and my parents. Children, parents, military designations, no doubt. Zek'tal set the photograph down with deliberate carelessness. Your species' emotional manipulation tactics are well documented. He continued his destructive tour, pulling apart Sarah's personal belongings with the enthusiasm of someone who had never learned the concept of respect. Books scattered across the floor, clothing thrown from storage compartments, a small potted plant, clearly tended with care, knocked over and left to spill soil across the deck. Through it all, Sarah Blake maintained her professional demeanor, but I could see the change in her posture, the careful way she moved, the slight narrowing of her eyes. Humans, I had learned, were quite good at controlling their emotions, right up until they decided to stop. Commander, she said, her voice now carrying an edge that would have warned any sensible being, I need to ask that you treat my belongings with more care. Some of these items have sentimental value. Zek'tal looked up from where he was rifling through her personal communications device. Sentimental value, another human weakness. Emotional attachment to objects demonstrates the primitive nature of your species. That, as they say in human parlance, was about to become a problem. What happened next was, in hindsight, as inevitable as gravity and twice as predictable. But Zek'tal, blessed with the observational skills of a sedated fungus, failed to notice that he had pushed Sarah Blake past the point where politeness mattered more than principle. The final straw came when Zek'tal's rummaging led him to Sarah's crew quarters, where he discovered her co-pilot Marcus Chen's personal belongings. Marcus, a quiet engineer who preferred fixing things to breaking them, was currently in the engine room running diagnostics. Another human, Zek'tal announced, as if he had uncovered evidence of a vast conspiracy. This confirms it. Multiple humans on one vessel, clearly a military operation. He's my co-pilot and engineer, Sarah said, her voice now carrying the kind of calm that experienced beings recognize as dangerous. He's been with me for 6 years. He fixes things. Things, Zek'tal repeated with obvious suspicion. What kinds of things? Weapons systems? Explosive devices? Communication equipment for coordinating attacks? Engines, life support, navigation systems, you know, the things that keep us from dying in the vacuum of space. Zek'tal waved all four hands dismissively. I think not. This vessel is clearly a threat to galactic security. I'm placing you and your crew under arrest pending a full investigation. And there it was, the moment when Sarah Blake's legendary patience finally ran out. Now wait, just one damned minute, Sarah said, stepping forward. The change in her demeanor was remarkable, like watching a dormant volcano suddenly remember it was supposed to be erupting. You boarded my ship without cause, destroyed my property, insulted my family, and now you want to arrest my crew? For what? Transporting coffee beans? Nimco actually took another step backward. The other subordinates had gone very still in that way intelligent creatures do when they sense impending disaster. You will address me with proper respect, human, Zek'tal snarled, puffing himself up to his full intimidating height. I am a commander in the Kethmoran Imperial Patrol. Your primitive species exists at the sufferance of your betters. Sarah Blake looked at him with the kind of expression humans reserved for particularly stupid insects. Respect. You want respect. Let me tell you what I think of your investigation, Commander. What followed was a masterclass in precisely articulated fury. Sarah Blake proceeded to explain, in terms that would have made a diplomat weep with envy, exactly what she thought of Zek'tal's competence, his investigation methods, his attitude toward other species, and his general worth as a sentient being. She did this without raising her voice, without using profanity, and without once stepping outside the bounds of diplomatic protocol. It was, quite simply, beautiful. Zek'tal's face went through several color changes that I had never seen in his species before. His subordinates were now openly staring at anything except their commanding officer. Nimco appeared to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. How dare you, Zek'tal finally managed, his voice cracking with outrage. How dare you speak to me with such honesty? Sarah suggested helpfully. That did it. Zek'tal completely lost what little remained of his composure, in a move that will be studied in military academies as an example of what not to do in tense situations. He stormed into the ship's small mess hall and grabbed the metal table that served as both dining surface and meeting area. The table, I should mention, was standard human construction, solid steel, built to withstand the rigors of space travel and designed to last decades under normal use. Zek'tal hoisted this table above his head with all four arms, clearly intending to demonstrate his superior strength and intimidate the uppity human into submission. It was, without question, the most spectacularly stupid decision I had ever witnessed, and I had once watched a Regalian attempt to negotiate with a black hole. This, Zek'tal announced dramatically, is what happens to those who disrespect the Kethmoran Empire. He brought the table down on Sarah Blake's head with every ounce of strength his species possessed. The table, constructed of good, honest human steel, met Sarah's head with a resounding crash that echoed through the ship's corridors. And then it broke. Not Sarah's head, mind you. The table. Sarah didn't even blink. She stood there, completely unfazed, while pieces of twisted metal clattered to the deck around her feet. A small dent appeared in the bulkhead behind her, where a fragment had ricocheted. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or catastrophe. Zek'tal stood there, still holding the table's legs, staring at the human who had just absorbed what should have been a devastating blow without so much as messing up her hair. Well, Sarah said conversationally, brushing a piece of metal debris off her shoulder, that was remarkably stupid even for you. And that, dear observers, was when Commander Zek'tal realized he might have made a tactical error. Sarah Blake reached down and picked up one of the larger table fragments, examining it with the casual interest of someone inspecting produce at a market. The piece of twisted metal was roughly the size of her hand and still warm from the impact. You know, Commander, she said, conversationally, turning the fragment over in her fingers. This is actually pretty good quality steel, Earth Standard Grade 7, if I'm not mistaken, built to last. She looked up at Zek'tal with what might have been genuine curiosity. Did you honestly think hitting me with furniture was going to accomplish something? Zek'tal, still clutching the table legs like some sort of demented sculptor, opened and closed his mouth several times without producing any sound. This was probably for the best, as anything he might have said would likely have made his situation considerably worse. See, here's the thing about human physiology, Sarah continued, her tone taking on the patient quality of a teacher explaining a particularly simple concept to a particularly slow student. We evolved on a high-gravity world. Our bone density is roughly 3 times that of your average spacefaring species. Our muscle fibers are designed to function under conditions that would crush most of you like empty beverage containers. She held up the table fragment for emphasis. This table was built for humans, by humans, using human engineering standards, which means it was designed to be tough enough for our use but not tougher than we are. Basic logic, really. Nimco had gone completely pale, which in his species involved a disturbing shift from purple to a sickly green color. The other subordinates were practicing the fine art of becoming invisible while standing in plain sight. Zek'tal finally found his voice, though it emerged as more of a squeak than the commanding tone he was probably aiming for. You're not injured? Not even slightly. Sarah tossed the metal fragment from hand to hand with casual ease. Though I have to say, Commander, assaulting a civilian during a routine inspection is going to look really bad on your service record. That was when Zek'tal's survival instincts, delayed though they were, finally kicked in. His fourth hand moved toward the energy weapon on his belt with what he probably thought was subtle stealth. Now I have observed many species in combat situations, and I can say with authority that humans move in ways that simply shouldn't be possible for creatures of their size and apparent bulk. Sarah Blake demonstrated this principle beautifully. One moment she was standing 3 meters away, casually discussing metallurgy and bone density. The next moment she was directly in front of Zek'tal, her hand wrapped around his wrist with enough force to prevent him from drawing his weapon. The movement was so fast that Zek'tal's eyes were still focused on where she had been standing. Now, Commander, Sarah said pleasantly, her grip apparently causing Zek'tal considerable discomfort. Drawing a weapon on an unarmed civilian is definitely against regulations. I'm going to have to ask you to reconsider that decision. Zek'tal, to his credit, attempted to resist. All 4 of his arms strained against Sarah's single-handed grip. His species was naturally stronger than most, and he had the advantage of multiple limbs. It made absolutely no difference. Sarah sighed with the weary patience of someone dealing with a persistent but harmless annoyance. You know what? I think you need a moment to calm down and think about your choices. What happened next was a masterpiece of controlled violence. Sarah's free hand moved in a precise arc that connected with a specific point on Zek'tal's neck. There was a small, sharp crack, like someone snapping a dry twig. Zek'tal's eyes went wide, then rolled back in his head. His legs folded and he collapsed to the deck like a marionette with severed strings. The silence that followed was profound. Even the ship's environmental systems seemed to pause in respectful acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. Relax, Sarah said to Zek'tal's subordinates, who were frozen in various poses of shock and terror. He's not dead, just unconscious. I hit the nerve cluster that controls motor function in your species. He'll be fine in a few hours, though he might have trouble turning his head for a week or 2. She knelt beside Zek'tal's motionless form and began checking his vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone with medical training. Pulse is steady, breathing is normal. Classic temporary paralysis. Nothing permanent. Nimco finally managed to speak, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. How did you know where to strike? Sarah looked up with a smile that was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. I spent 12 years in the human colonial marines, Officer Nimco. 6 of those were in the Xenobiology Corps. Part of my training involved learning the anatomical weak points of every known sentient species. She returned to her examination of Zek'tal. You know, just in case situations like this arose. She produced a small medical scanner from her coveralls and ran it over Zek'tal's neck. Minimal tissue damage, no permanent nerve disruption. Full recovery expected within 72 hours. Textbook non-lethal incapacitation. Standing, she addressed the stunned officers with the air of someone conducting a training seminar. Now, according to Galactic Patrol Regulations, Section 47, Subsection 12, any officer who assaults a civilian during an inspection is subject to immediate disciplinary action. The appropriate response is to contact station security and file a formal complaint through proper diplomatic channels. She moved to her ship's communication panel, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I suggest you gentlemen prepare statements explaining how your commanding officer came to be unconscious on my deck surrounded by broken furniture. Nimco looked down at his motionless superior, then at Sarah, then at the scattered table fragments. This is all going in the report? Sarah's smile widened. Every single detail, officer. Every single detail. Station security arrived precisely 14 minutes later, led by Chief Gordon, a Valaxian whose long career in law enforcement had taught him to approach unusual situations with an open mind and a ready sense of humor. What he found in the Lucky Strike's mess hall, however, tested even his considerable experience. Commander Zek'tal lay unconscious on the deck, surrounded by the twisted remains of what had once been a perfectly functional table. His three subordinates stood against the far wall, wearing expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their life choices, and Captain Sarah Blake sat calmly at her navigation console, filing what appeared to be extremely detailed paperwork. "Well," Chief Gorian said after surveying the scene, "this is certainly interesting. Captain Blake, would you care to explain why there's an unconscious Kethmoran officer decorating your floor?" Sarah looked up from her reports with the weary expression of someone who had spent the last hour dealing with bureaucracy. "He assaulted me with furniture, Chief," I responded with appropriate force. "All documented and filed according to proper procedure." She handed him a data pad containing her formal complaint, complete with timestamps, witness statements from Nimco and the other officers, and high-resolution images of the crime scene. "You'll find everything in order. Medical scans showing his condition, security footage from my ship's internal cameras, and a full incident report filed with both the Galactic Patrol Internal Affairs Division and the Human Colonial Diplomatic Office." Chief Gordon scrolled through the documentation with growing amazement. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had never seen such thorough paperwork filed so quickly after an incident. "Captain, this is remarkably comprehensive. Most beings would still be in shock." "I'm not most beings, Chief." That, as it turned out, was something of an understatement. The background check that Chief Gordon ran on Sarah Blake revealed a service record that read like an adventure novel written by someone with a very active imagination and a detailed knowledge of military tactics. Colonial Marines, Xenobiology Corps, Special Operations Division, 3 tours in the Rigel sector conflicts, decorated for valor twice, and certified in 17 different forms of non-lethal combat techniques. "Captain Blake," Chief Gordon said carefully, "your file indicates you were part of the team that resolved the Kepler Station hostage crisis 3 years ago." "Among other things," Sarah replied without looking up from her paperwork, "I retired from active service to pursue a more peaceful career in cargo transport. Seemed like less stressful work." Chief Gordon glanced at the unconscious Zek'tal. "How's that working out for you?" "Well, today's been a bit unusual." By the time the medical team arrived to transport Zek'tal to the station's medical facility, word of the incident had already begun spreading through Haven's Rest with the speed that only truly spectacular gossip can achieve. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the basic facts remained consistent. A human cargo captain had been attacked with a table and had responded by politely incapacitating her attacker. Within 6 hours, the incident had acquired a name: the table event. Within 12 hours, someone had created a holographic recreation that was being shown in 3 of the station's entertainment venues. By the end of the week, vendors were selling miniature tables labeled Zek'tal's Folly in the gift shops. The effect on human-alien relations was immediate and noticeable. Other alien species, who had previously regarded humans as newcomers to be tolerated with mild condescension, suddenly developed a much more respectful attitude toward Earth's representatives. Cargo inspections that had once taken hours were completed in minutes. Customs officials who had previously demanded extensive documentation now accepted human manifests with barely a glance. Sarah Blake, for her part, seemed bemused by her sudden fame. She completed her cargo delivery to Centauri Prime ahead of schedule, collected her payment, and returned to Haven's Rest for her next assignment. The only visible change to her ship was a new display case in the mess hall, containing the larger pieces of the destroyed table mounted on a simple plaque that read, "Communications Breakdown, Haven's Rest Station, Stardate 23087.1. When asked about it by curious visitors, Sarah would simply smile and say, "Sometimes furniture makes better art than it does weapons." As for Commander Zek'tal, his recovery was complete and uneventful. The paralysis faded after 68 hours, exactly as Sarah had predicted. The damage to his pride, however, proved considerably more persistent. His superiors in the Kethmoran patrol, after reviewing the incident reports, security footage and witness statements, concluded that placing Zek'tal in a position where he might encounter other species was perhaps not the best use of his talents. He was quietly transferred to a desk position at a monitoring station in the Outer Rim, where his duties involved cataloging asteroid movements and filing mineral surveys. The assignment was described officially as a promotion to strategic resource analysis. Everyone understood it for what it actually was, the career equivalent of being sent to count rocks in the middle of nowhere. Zek'tal never quite recovered from what his medical file delicately described as furniture-related trauma. Witnesses reported that he would flinch whenever he encountered tables, chairs, or any other piece of movable furniture. He took to eating his meals standing up and requesting that all meetings be conducted in rooms furnished only with wall-mounted fixtures. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. 6 months after what historians would eventually catalogue as the table incident, the ripple effects of that 14-minute encounter had spread across civilized space like ink through water, touching every corner of the galactic trade network in ways that no one could have predicted. The most immediate and practical result was what human traders began calling the Blake effect. Cargo inspections that had once required hours of tedious paperwork and invasive searches were now completed with remarkable efficiency. Customs officials would glance at human manifests, nod politely, and wave ships through with phrases like, "Everything appears to be in order, Captain, and no need for a full inspection today." The Regalian Trade Authority, previously notorious for their exhaustive examination procedures, issued a memo to all inspection stations advising that special consideration should be given to human vessels to ensure efficient processing. The Centauri Customs Guild went even further, creating a new express lane specifically for human haulers, complete with priority docking and streamlined procedures. It wasn't just bureaucrats who had taken notice. Throughout the galaxy, the story of Captain Sarah Blake and her educational encounter with Commander Zek'tal had become the stuff of legend, told and retold in countless variations across 1,000 different worlds. In the cargo hauler bars of Proxima Station, Sarah Blake had achieved something approaching mythical status. Her image now decorated the walls alongside other heroes of independent freight, and the Lucky Strike specifications had been memorized by pilots who treated her ship like a sacred relic. The Haulers Guild had even commissioned a statue, though Sarah had politely declined the honor. "I just delivered coffee beans," she had told the delegation. "It's not like I saved the galaxy." The delegation had looked at her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures, and replied, "Captain, you made it possible for the rest of us to deliver coffee beans without being harassed by idiots with badges." The story had evolved in the telling, of course, as all good stories do. Some versions had Sarah defeating an entire squadron of Galactic patrol officers. Others claimed she had used the table as a weapon rather than simply absorbing its impact. A particularly creative variant suggested that she had single-handedly revolutionized interspecies diplomacy through strategic furniture deployment. But the core truth remained unchanged. When threatened, a human cargo captain had responded with exactly the right amount of force to resolve the situation while maintaining professional standards. This combination of competence and restraint had impressed species across the galaxy in ways that centuries of formal diplomacy had failed to achieve. As for Zek'tal himself, his recovery from the physical effects of the encounter was complete, but the psychological impact proved more persistent. His medical files, classified but occasionally leaked by sources who found them amusing, documented an increasingly severe case of what his therapists termed environmental furniture anxiety disorder. He had progressed from simple table avoidance to a comprehensive fear of any movable furniture. Chairs, desks, cabinets, even decorative sculptures triggered what his doctors described as acute stress responses. His quarters at the Outer Rim monitoring station had been specially modified with all fixtures permanently mounted to walls and floors. His weekly therapy sessions, conducted via holo communication to avoid the furniture-laden environment of the medical facility, showed little progress. When pressed by his therapist about the root of his fears, Zek'tal would only repeat, "You didn't see what she did to that table. You didn't see how she looked at me afterward." The final irony was that humans, a species that had spent decades trying to convince the galaxy to take them seriously as a spacefaring civilization, had achieved that goal through what was essentially a furniture-related misunderstanding. They were no longer dismissed as primitive newcomers or treated with condescending tolerance. Instead, they had earned something far more valuable, genuine respect based on demonstrated competence and restraint. Though throughout the galaxy, in the quiet corners of diplomatic cocktail parties and trade negotiation lounges, humans had acquired an unofficial but widely recognized designation. They were now known, with a mixture of admiration and healthy caution, as the Table Breakers.